listening to Stories from Real Life, a podcast by engaging storytellers for engaged story listeners. Here's your host, author and journalist, Melvin E. Edwards.
Hello, and welcome to this August 13th edition of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. My daughter, Leanne, is pinch hitting for John Williams this week, and she'll tell us about today's guest, Pat Kahnke.
On today's edition of Stories from Real Life, with host Melvin E. Edwards. Today, we welcome Pat Kahnke, who is recognized for his diverse communication skills, especially in video podcasting. He's a former pastor in St. Paul, Minnesota, and is set to release his second book this month. With 2 decades of experience as a pastor, he delves into stimulating dialogues about complex interplay between belief systems and governance, and the dangers of Christian nationalism. Pat's YouTube channel is called Culture, Faith, and Politics and has 25,000 subscribers. Some of his videos have drawn 250,000 views. While much of his following has been because of his political stances, he is also here today to talk about other things that interest him, like skinning muskrats in Minnesota and rooting for the Vikings. Yes, I said skinning muskrats. Here's our guest, Pat Kahnke, and host, Melvin E. Edwards.
Thank you, Leanne. I appreciate that. Pat Kahnke, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Well, this show is kind of a free form because you have a lot of different kinds of things that you're interested in.
Yeah.
So let's start near the beginning, not all the way at the beginning, but near the beginning.
Okay.
You graduated from Mankato East High School. Like, the only thing I know about that town is the Ingalls family lived there on the show Little House on the Prairie. So my first question is, were you a classmate of Laura Ingalls?
I was not. She graduated just a few years ahead of me. So, yeah, I mean, I knew her little sister, but, you know. Yeah, it is kind of a fun thing from when I was growing up, just watching those shows, and every once in a while Mankato would get mentioned. And I drive all over the state, and so I drive down, you know, into those towns where she lived, and I've driven across Plum Creek 100 times, and you know, it's just, yeah, kind of a cool thing. The other thing Mankato would be known for is the My Pillow guy is from Mankato.
Okay,
Mike
I did
Lindell.
not know that.
Yeah. He moved, I think, before he would have been like my older brother's age. So that's the other thing that Mankato's famous for.
So Laura Ingalls, or the Ingalls family, and My Pillow.
Mike Lindell, yeah.
So speaking of the Ingalls, do you think Pa Ingalls could have skinned a muskrat faster than you?
Pa Ingalls could not have skinned a muskrat faster than me. Yeah, I've joked about, but semi-seriously, I at least when I was young, when I was in high school, I would have said that I was the fastest muskrat skinner in Minnesota. And I say that because my dad and mom were into a lot of different things. They owned a restaurant. They were both public school teachers. That was their main thing. And they farmed, but my dad was also the local fur buyer for, you know, the area right around. And it was pretty, back then in the, you know, 70s and 80s, that was big industry in southern Minnesota. So people would bring in, you know, hundreds of muskrats that they caught, you know, during the opening season. Wow. And I ran a little crew of high school kids, you know, from the time I was like 13, I ran this crew of, you know, muskrats, raccoons, fox, mink, all of it. And it's just kind of a funny, it's funny because for me, it was normal. So like I stayed home one day, I remember, and skinned 750 muskrats instead of going to school in that day.
Whoa.
And yeah, I mean, I got pretty good at it. The quickest was 12 seconds, but I would average with breaks and everything about 1 a minute for 12 hours, you know, and it's just a weird part of my life. And I told, but it was normal to me. I told a friend of mine about that from California years ago. And he said, he couldn't relate at all. And he said, Pat, if you told 100 people that story, 100 of them would lose respect for you. And I was like, well, okay, I guess it's just part of Southern Minnesota culture. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really relate to it, but I haven't lost any respect for you yet. but we're still at the beginning of the conversation.
Yeah, but
everything reminds me of a song.
Yeah.
I'm sure you did. Yeah, everything reminds me of a song, and obviously you can probably guess that one reminds me of the Captain and Tennille's Muskrat Love.
That's great. I grew up singing that song while I worked. So
whistling and singing along with the Captain and Tennille. All right, so let's talk about sports. So you're a lifelong fan of your hometown sports. Like I am. My hometown is Houston, so I appreciate when somebody roots for their home area teams. So you're from Minnesota. So how are you feeling about the upcoming season for the Vikings?
I'm feeling good about it. I don't have super high expectations because, the new quarterback, but it's fun to have this J.J. McCarthy. I hope he sees the field sometime this year just to see what he can do, but I don't think they're going to rush him. I hope they don't rush him. I hope they don't rush him because it's kind of a year that with not great expectations, which is kind of nice in a way. I hope they bring him along, at the right pace. But I mean, we've got Justin Jefferson, and I think a young quarterback could do an awful lot with the receivers we've got too. So we'll see.
Yeah, and C.J. Stroud is the quarterback for my Texans. Yeah. So I think he's sort of changed the dynamic for what can be expected from a rookie quarterback. And unfortunately, that's probably going to hurt some rookies who just, under normal circumstances, would not be ready for the pace of the NFL.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But I think we're pretty clear here that the expectations are not for him to play, which is good. I think you could ruin a person by, doing it too soon. So we'll see. Right now, he's practicing with the third team, from what I've heard. So they're not putting too high expectations on right now, but it's exciting. Okay. I mean, I think by next year it could be a really fun team to watch. I grew up doing that with my dad. I mean, growing up, that was always such a huge thing. We'd go to church on Sunday morning, and then I'd come home and watch that with my dad. And I'd keep the schedule on the wall of the wins and losses. And, when I was a little kid, I kind of lived and died emotionally by how they did that week. I'm not that way anymore, but it is still a great break from some of the just more somber things in life. It's nice to have sports for that.
Yeah, I love football, but that's only my second favorite sport, so I don't live and die with the outcome. Right. Baseball is my passion. I do live and die with the outcome for the Houston Astros.
Yeah, right.
So you're also a baseball fan.
Yeah, I apologize because the Twins are 4-2 against them this year. So
I don't want to talk about that.
That's unusual.
I do want to talk about
Astros own us, so it's just funny this year.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. We may face each other in the playoffs again.
Right.
So who are some of your all-time favorite players for the Twins or the Vikings?
Well, for the Twins, I mean, obviously I grew up like in the Kirby Puckett era, and then even before that, but I really got into them during the Kirby Puckett era. So that's the thing. And then there were probably a couple decades where I didn't pay a lot of attention to any sports. I was raising kids and stuff. But so the Kirby Puckett era is really big for me. I've only gotten one autograph though, and it was by Mickey Hatcher. Do you remember Mickey Hatcher?
I do remember Mickey Hatcher, but I remember him from the Dodgers, where he started his career.
Played with the Twins for a few years, and he was, I just thought he was a character. I remember him running into the wall in the outfield and stuff like that. He wasn't, he was like a guy who just, he seemed to play above his abilities an awful lot, when he was with the Twins. And it was just, I just thought he was a character. So I remember being about 19 years old or something like that and bringing my glove to the game. And there were all these little kids gathered around Mickey Hatcher. He was by the sideline, like before the game. And I was like, I didn't know what to call him. It felt rude to say, hey, Mickey, so I said, Mr. Hatcher. I'm like 19, and he looked at me like I was the biggest idiot. And he signed it. I wish I had it. I lost the glove. Someday I'll find it again. But so he was kind of my favorite player, but not the one who was like a superstar like Kirby Puckett. So.
What about for the Vikings? Who are some of your favorite players all time for that team?
Yeah, the Vikings. I mean, so I watched them during the Fran Tarkenton era. And so he was, from the time I was a little kid, he was sort of the guy, so I love to watch him scramble around. And then later on, Randy Moss, obviously, but I grew up more like with Carl Eller, people like that. And
the Purple People Eaters.
Right. That's when I was a little kid. They were the ones that really just because. And I think the reason I have an affection for that time, even though I didn't understand the game real well as a little kid, but I have an affection for it because I watched it with my dad. That was the thing, So it's like it's just so associated with my dad, that era of the Vikings. So he just passed away, a year ago, a little over a year ago, and so I have a lot of affection for that era. So.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah. But yeah, it's pretty cool the way you can form bonds with your parents around sporting events. Like baseball is the reason why baseball is my passion is because of the same thing. I used to watch with my dad and go to lots of games with my dad. Right.
Yep. Yeah, they used to take us to what they called knot-hole games when I was a little kid. It's all they could afford were these like really cheap double headers for baseball at the the Twins at the old Met Stadium where now the Mall of America is. But they called them knot-hole games, and it was double headers during the day, and they could afford to bring us kids there for those. That's what I grew up going there to those, once a year or whatever. It was a huge deal. It was really, really fun memories.
I love doubleheaders. I probably didn't miss a doubleheader for like 10 years, 10 straight years or something like that. I love doubleheaders.
Yeah.
All right, so I understand you had an interesting experience when you first met someone from Texas. Oh. So I want to know what it is that you did wrong in that situation.
Yeah, I'm sure it was me. I just don't know what I did, so maybe you can tell me, except I don't remember what I said. But so when I was in high school, the summer before my senior year, I won a scholarship to go out to a science seminar at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. There were like 2 kids from each state, and we flew out there. So there were 100 of us there, and it was a week-long deal. And I've always been like super shy. I'm still working on that. Even as a pastor for 20 years, I still, I'm getting better with it. But I was painfully shy back then. And I remember very vividly, there was a kid, maybe he was Ted Cruz. I don't even know who this was. Let's just say it was Ted Cruz. Let's just say it. I don't know if it's true, but he's got to be about my age. So Ted, no, I don't know who this kid was, but he wore a cowboy hat. He was from Texas, and he was, I think, probably a football player. But he was one of those guys that everybody, none of us knew each other, but people gravitated to him, and he had charisma. And I remember walking, like I was trying to be part of the group, and I said something. I took a risk and said something about whatever was being taught. And he just looked at me and said, "Shut up." And I was like, okay, so that's Texas. And so you're the second person I've ever talked to from Texas. So you've got to fix that, So you haven't told me to shut up. So, no, I'm kidding.
No, I'm much kinder than that. I would say, could you please just stop talking? No.
I have no idea what I said. I don't know what I said. To this day, It was nothing weird. It wasn't.
Well, just for the record, it probably wasn't Ted Cruz, because I think Ted is probably 50 years old, so he wouldn't have been in high school.
So, yeah, I'm 58, so yeah. So it was pretty funny. Like, it wasn't funny at the time. I was just like, well, okay, I guess people from Texas, that's how they relate to people from Minnesota. So he probably hated my accent. Who knows?
Speaking of Texas and Minnesota, are you still just holding a grudge against Texas because of the Herschel Walker trade with the Dallas Cowboys?
Oh my gosh, that was. I mean, that eviscerated the Vikings. Yeah, I've talked about Herschel Walker a couple times. I don't think I did in my first book. I might have in there, but I said, the people who are backing Herschel Walker, for Congress, for Senate, I can tell you right now what's going to happen. He's gonna, you're going to put all your hope in him. You're going to trade away your future for him. Then he's going to take the ball, dance around a little bit behind the line of scrimmage, and then get tackled for a loss, and then talk about himself in the third person after the game.
That was pretty accurate.
That was my experience of Herschel Walker. So, yeah, I couldn't believe he was running for Senate. Like, oh yeah, I know this guy.
Yeah, we're going to try to minimize politics on this show, but I know we're going to have to talk about it at some point. That's sort of where you make your that's your bread and butter on your show, talking about politics. So we'll come back around to that a little bit. We won't talk about Ted Cruz and Herschel Walker anymore. Though.
Yeah. I for the record, I named my channel Culture, Faith, and Politics, with politics last, because I don't want it to be about politics. It just is right now, but that's not what I ultimately enjoy talking about. So, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about church then. You're a former pastor, and you started a church from scratch there in Minnesota. Tell me about that process. What that was like for you? Yeah,
so church planting, that's a big part of my background. So I had done tons of jobs before that. Like, I married my wife when, we were pretty young. And I know her father-in-law looked at me and kind of always worried about, is she going to be all right? Is he going to provide for her? Because I did a lot of different jobs, but they all kind of prepared me where eventually I was at Bethlehem Baptist Church with John Piper for 6 years. He doesn't know me, but I was at this church and I learned a lot from his preaching. And while I was there, I sensed a call into church planting, specifically to start a church in my neighborhood, which is a very mixed neighborhood. Frogtown's like the poorest neighborhood in St. Paul. It's an immigrant community, lots of Hmong people. It's just ethnically diverse. And I felt like I think I'm supposed to start a church here. So I went to seminary. And during that time that I was in seminary, I was working lots of jobs while I was in seminary. And I was helping to start another church at the University of Minnesota as learning, So I spent 6 years doing that. And when I finally got a full-time position at that church, and I was done with seminary, I was happy, obviously. And I talked to my father-in-law a week later, and he was so happy, that I was doing that. And I said, but I have to tell you, next year I'm leaving there and I'm going to start a church in Frogtown in St. Paul, which, by the way, starting a church in the inner city like that usually has a 95% failure rate, and but I felt called to it. So I told my father-in-law this, and he looked at me and he said, so what is it about stability that you don't like? It was and that's when I realized, I've put this guy through a lot worrying about his daughter, but it worked out really well. And so we planted that church in Frogtown in 2002. And and it was just a nice, small neighborhood church, but we were mixed ethnicities, we were super mixed on politics, income, just, I spoke to people every day, every Sunday who hadn't graduated high school, all the way up to, or over to whatever, medical doctors, PhDs. We had this just kind of beautiful mix. And I sort of learned how to talk to a broad range of people by doing that too. Because that's kind of challenging to do a message that's going to, help people across that kind of a range. So I loved the diversity of that community there. And then I retired in 2016 because the plan always was to sort of get it up and running. And I felt called to plant that church. I didn't feel called to a lifetime of pastoral ministry. So I always kind of knew when I got to be about 50, I was going to move on. And that's what happened.
Okay. So since retiring from that, you become a software engineer, a writer, a YouTuber. And this year you bought a reefer truck that you've been driving around to make money while you transitioned into full-time writing. So clearly you still don't like stability.
I still don't like stability. Yeah. It's funny because I went through training to get, to become a software engineer, and it was a good experience, and I did it for 7 years and had a good job. But the thing is that as this, I wrote my previous book while I was a software engineer and writing at night and everything, it was an awful lot, and so this year I just knew I was going to be writing again, and I just decided I need to transition into just writing. So the way I did it is I bought a refrigerator truck because I have a friend who does that sort of thing, and I work a totally flexible schedule delivering food, produce to like schools and that sort of thing. And this summer it's more like coffee shops and stuff like that. But I can, so now I'm taking like a month off to finish my book. And so it's given me the flexibility to do this. And then I'm building a career now as a writer and podcaster and stuff like that. So sometime this year, the plan is to just be doing that full time. So, yeah. And I'm hoping that it's not built around politics. The reason I'm not doing like a Patreon or anything like that right now to raise funds to do this for a living right now is because doing that would lock me into having to talk about politics. And I'm writing these books right now out of a sense of urgency, but that's not how I want to spend my life thinking about it. It's kind of a dark area to be thinking about a lot.
So how did you become interested in writing? I get the sense this isn't something you've done long term.
Writing I have done. I mean, so I've loved writing. Like I read your book, your first book, about how you were a really good writer as a kid. And I was like that too. But I wish that I had actually, well, I shouldn't say I wish, I don't have regrets, but I would have enjoyed having the sort of guts that you had to try to make a living at it back then. So I've always been an amateur. I've done freelance writing for magazines and things like that. I've written like a couple of novels. I've worked on them. It's really fun, but not, so I've done writing my whole life, but this was the first serious writing that I did 4 years ago when I wrote my first book. And now I learned a lot by doing that. So this is my second one I'm working on now. I've done songwriting, I'm a musician. I do all that sort of creative stuff, with words. I love it. Music. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so speaking of books, tell me some of your favorite books all time.
So I would say my favorite book is Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. And I don't know why. I can't tell you exactly why, except that I was 39 when I read it. And I think the narrator of that book, Charles Ryder, is 39 at that time. And going through, it's just, there's something I find beautiful about the language and about the story. It's got a lot of depth to it. So yeah, Brideshead Revisited. I love that. I remember another one that I loved is All the King's Men. I read that many years ago, like I think in college or around that. I never read what I was assigned, but during that period, I read, I read All the King's Men, and it's another one. Both of them are. I love the way that both of them have sort of a retrospective, section in it where it's like flashback, and they're both done really well in that way, but also deal with, issues that are important. In All the King's Men, it's, like political corruption and all that, but very much betrayal and, human things like that. And the same with Brideshead Revisited. But, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings. I grew up with all that, C.S. Lewis. My mom brought home, when I was in third grade, she brought home The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis, a box set, and The Lord of the Rings. So in third grade, I read all the Chronicles of Narnia, and then I read the whole Lord of the Rings. And I was so young that I had trouble separating the fantasy from reality a little bit, but I was living in that Lord of the Rings world. I was living in Middle Earth. And when it ended, I vividly remember crying because it was over. And so I read them again. So, I mean, that was months probably that I was just living there in third grade. And then fifth grade, I read them again. And seventh grade, I've read them, haven't read them in recent years. I should probably do it again.
So do you consider Minnesota to be Middle Earth?
Well, what I do think is our church, the church that I planted with my wife and our friends, our church were definitely hobbits. And so I've talked about this before. We're the kind of people who were dancing on the tables, like very humble, people dancing on the tables with our beer thing or whatever, but I came from Bethlehem Baptist, which they're elves. It's sort of like the holiness and the purity and the deep, somber, beauty, like high beauty, And so I've talked about that before, that we're hobbits. I came from elves. And then somebody asked me once when I told them that, well, then who are the dwarves? And I said, well, that's easy. That's the mega churches. They build all these things. They build these huge things, but they dig too deep, and anyway, and it all sort of falls apart.
So you said all that to say Minnesota is Middle Earth. Minnesota
has all of the Middle Earth tribes in it. Yep. No, I grew up in Hobbiton, basically. I mean, that's what my, where I grew up out in rural southern Minnesota. That's what it looks like.
Okay. So let's switch over to music real quick. Okay. So you're a big music fan. So tell me some of your favorite musical artists.
Oh, well, the fact that I'm a white guy from, the 80s, who is a Christian, U2 is like huge. Like they were just, from the time I was in high school and their second album, I heard them. Fell in love with them, so it's like I watched their career. So that's sort of like just normal, people from my demographic love you too, and but and then like goes along with that is like REM, those sorts of bands. That's the era where I was in high school. I didn't like the pop 80s stuff. I was more into the like alternative music and that sort of thing. But Bob Dylan was my first like huge influence, in high school. And I'm not from that generation, obviously. I was weird in 1983 and 84 to be such a huge Dylan fan, but I just loved his lyricism and I loved his voice, and people, some people like it, some don't, but I loved his phrasing. I thought he was hilarious sometimes. I thought he was deep sometimes, and I just got really into Dylan. And then so that whole, genre, Neil Young, the singer-songwriter thing, I'll tell you this, I love Joni Mitchell, okay? And it's kind of a funny story or interesting story to me how I fell in love with Joni Mitchell is that my brother worked on cars, my older brother, and he had an old car out in back. And I was just digging through this old car that he happened to have, it was a junk car. And I found a little cassette tape that somebody had written Ladies of the Canyon on. It was just written in pen, Ladies of the Canyon. So it was ripped. I had no idea. You don't have the internet. I lived in the sticks, so I didn't know what this was, but I listened to it, and I thought, I fell in love with Joni Mitchell before I ever knew who she was. It was a few years later that I figured out, oh, that's Joni Mitchell. I was just this kid out in the country listening to it, and so when I finally found out who she was, I got into all of her stuff. But yeah, so kind of cool, that. I love all that singer-songwriter stuff. I love that sort of thing. Right now,
you're only a year.
Jason Isbell. Jason Isbell is one of the great, singer-songwriter types now,
Yeah, he records out in Muscle Shoals.
Yeah.
So I went out there back in September for the 60th anniversary of the Fame recording studios, and I'm friends with Rick Hall Jr. His parents were the ones who started the recording studio there in Muscle Shoals.
Okay. Oh, that's amazing.
That was a fun experience.
Yeah. That would have been that. Well, he's from Muscle Shoals, right? I think he's actually from there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That'd be a great place to grow up. How could you not be a musician?
Yeah, you'd have to be. I'm not sure what other options you would have.
It's like I was a muskrat skinner. He was a musician. It's where you grow up.
All right, so my best friend is your age. You both are about a year older than I am, and he also is a huge Bob Dylan fan. Mm. So your books have been warnings about cults and cultish behavior. So how do you explain your Bob Dylan fandom? How does that qualify as cultish?
It's almost to that level. I would say the difference is if Bob Dylan, gets on a stage and says that I need personally, if I, Pat, need to go do such and such a thing, I'm not going to do it. But I'll defend Bob Dylan. I'll defend his music to the day I die. But yeah, it is like it's one of those things. Like some of the things that we're into. Who knows like it's beyond me being able to be dispassionate about it. I can't be objective about it at this point. It's some of those things go so deep. It's like this. I was at a certain age. I bought an old album of his. The first time I ever went to a used record store. It was called Hard Rain. It's a live album. It's not one of his great albums, but being that age when I bought it, and listening to that voice and those lyrics, it just hooked me. And so I can't really even be objective about it. It's who I am,
Well, yeah, my friend who's just as passionate about Dylan, and I have so much respect for him. He and I have been friends for 40 years. Mm-hmm. And so I've tried to get into Dylan just because I know how much he loves Dylan. And so he'll occasionally send me a song link or something. And after a while, I just thought I can't listen to his voice anymore. But I love the way he writes. I love the way he writes. So if he sends me a link of a song, I'll just find the lyrics to it and I'll just read the lyrics rather than listen to it. Although he did find one song that I really liked. There was a couple years ago. He sent me. I think it's called Must Be Christmas or something like that, a Christmas song that Bob Dylan did. And I actually did like that, and his voice didn't turn me off from it.
That's funny. Yeah. If you want to know, I love all of it. People would probably tell you to listen to Blood on the Tracks. That's a great album, a classic album. But the song that I would direct anyone to as possibly his best song or my favorite of his songs is It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding. if you listen to the lyrics to that song, even today, those lyrics, just like, how did he write that? I mean, I look at the lyrics and I go, how did he do that? Like, this is, and apparently he wrote it pretty fast from what I heard, but it's like, there's, it's all right, Ma, I'm only bleeding. Like, I would be pretty happy if I ever accomplished something like that one song in my life. And he's written dozens of them like that. But yeah, so I'd recommend read the lyrics, and listen to, I don't know who you like, Barry Manilow, listen to Barry Manilow.
Barry Manilow. Well, I do like you too, so we do overlap there, but no, I'm not much of a Barry Manilow fan. I'm a child of the 80s. Yeah. I like Prince. Prince is one of my favorite. I'm a huge Beatles fan. Yeah, Beatles. Yeah,
my brother.
I didn't think about the connection there with.
My brother got to watch him live just a few months before he died because, he would have concerts out at his place in Chanhassen by Minneapolis, and my brother worked for the Timberwolves, and he got invited after the Lynx, because the Timberwolves and Lynx, the women's basketball team are connected. When the Lynx won, they got to go, like, after they clinched the playoffs, Prince had all of them, and so my brother got to go along out to his place to watch him, and he played for 4 hours from 1 in the morning or until 4 and 5 in the morning, and the guy is incredibly gifted. He was incredibly gifted. He just kept going, every instrument, and just an amazing musician.
I had a guest a few months ago who did the opening song for this podcast, and he's a professional musician, and he was scrolling on the internet one weekend. He was bored around Christmas time and saw that an A-list musician was looking for somebody to fill in for the last couple of weeks of a tour, and it didn't indicate who it was. So he sent in some information. They called him and they said, "We'd like to have you come in for an audition." And it turned out that musician was Prince. So he got to travel around with Prince for the last 2 weeks of Prince's tour, because the person who was normally there had some other, it wasn't somebody who was actually in his band, somebody who was filling in and had some obligations. So he got to fill in and got to mostly watch him perform for 2 weeks. And that was a pretty amazing experience, according to this guy.
Yeah, he's one of, so when you talk about Minnesota, like things people were proud of, I mean, there's Mike Lindell, obviously, number one, the My Pillow guy. And then there's Bob Dylan, and there's Prince, they're royalty, So, yeah. And what's beautiful about Prince is that he stayed here. He set up his studio here. He was here his whole life. And that's pretty special to us. It was a very sad time when he passed. Absolutely.
It's funny that yesterday I like to listen to some old Casey Kasem countdown shows, and there was a serious. I don't know. One of the internet stations has regular Casey Kasem countdown shows from the 70s and 80s, and I was listening to one
that would be fun to listen
just yesterday, and it had. Prince's first top 40 song was on the countdown that week, and he was telling the story about how Prince turned down offers from 4 record companies because they wouldn't allow him to also be the producer. So he wanted to be able to play all the instruments, write all of his own songs, and produce all of his own songs. And Warner Brothers was the first one that would agree to let him do it, and he was a teenager at the time.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Yeah, he was confident that way, and rightly so, just incredibly gifted.
Yeah. All right, so let's go around to talk about politics. So this is where all right, I want to talk about your books. I normally avoid talking about politics, but your books are about that, and it's we're in an era where it's hard to avoid the subject. And so you want to talk about the subject with reasonable clarity and seriousness.
Yeah.
But let's talk about you've already written one book and you're writing another book on politics.
Yeah.
So speaking to Christians, what would you say to them about the subject of being a part of the Donald Trump era, whether or not you're a Donald Trump supporter or not?
Yeah, I would say, clearly now I'm on my second book where I'm, critiquing Donald Trump and his tactics and his movement from a Christian perspective. So just to be clear, that's where I come down on it. My concern is that I think it comes down in the end to a misunderstanding of what is the kingdom of God. I think that if the kingdom of God is something that we're supposed to muscle up and bring into existence through political means and at any cost, then sure, okay, then I guess you go get the strongest guy you can find to fight for you, but that's not what the kingdom of God is. And I think so it starts with a false understanding of what the role of Christians is in the world. So right now I'm applying it to the Trump movement, but I would apply the same thing if it were happening from the left. It's just that's not where it's coming from. I've been Republican my whole life. I voted for Ronald Reagan in '84. That was the first time I could vote. And I say in my book that I said I don't want to overstate, my conservative credentials as a young lad, but I did have a poster of Richard Nixon on my wall as a second grader.
You're like Alex Eaton from Family Ties.
Right. So that was kind of what I was like. And for me, a huge issue has always been the sanctity of life. And so I was super involved in that movement before I went into ministry. So I'll say two things to answer your question. The first thing I would say, I'll tell you right now because I'm going to forget. The second thing I want to say is about the echo chamber. So remind me, because I'll forget by the time I get there. But the first thing is that if I could ask Christians to do one thing, and this would apply across the board, it would be to not identify ourselves based on the issues that we support, but rather to identify ourselves by having integrity to the mission that God has called us on, and to live in such a way that we don't sacrifice our integrity, because in the end, that's all we've got. So if we define ourselves by I support this issue and I'm opposed to this issue, politicians are always on every side. They're really good at taking legitimate concerns that we have. I'm talking to Christians, but this is everybody. They'll take a legitimate concern that you have and they'll turn that into an issue. They'll shape that into an issue, and they'll weaponize it. They'll shape it into such a way where it's the most divisive way to shape it in order to cement you into their camp. And if we let people do that on any side, if we let people just basically buy off our conscience in exchange for giving us a few issues, it leads to where we're at right now, where I think in the end it hollows us out as people. I've seen it hollowing out churches. Lots of churches are being divided or strained. I see it hollowing out the conservative movement in ways that I just find really regrettable, because that's what I used to be. Until 2016, that was my tribe. And now one of the things I said I haven't switched over to becoming the other tribe. The way I put it in my book, this new one that I'm working on, is I read a book by China Miéville a few years ago called The City in the City. And it's about this group of people it's a city where there are two separate people groups living side by side in the very same space, but there's a magical, mysterious power that enforces you don't make eye contact with them, You don't acknowledge them. It's like it's a city and a city. And I've said that that's kind of what America has become. It's a nation and a nation. But we're not being enforced from the outside. We're doing it to ourselves. So there's two Americas right now. And I think demagogues of any stripe get their power by creating multiple Americas, by getting us angry at each other. And that's where their power comes from. So I was kind of kicked out of the America that I was in for the first 50 years of my life. I felt like I was driven out of that America by my conscience. I couldn't go along. But when I started to say those sorts of things, I was very unwelcome saying those things in my circles. And so, but I don't want to just go into the other America. I don't want to just say, okay, now I'm the other. I want to be a bridge. I want to bridge that. I still have all these values that led me to be part of the America I was part of. I have additional things. I mean, you can't be a pastor in the inner city for 20 years and not be shaped by that. So I've rejected some of the things that I believed back then, and I've added some from the other America. I've become a more well-rounded human being, I suppose, but I still care about so many things that I've always cared about. And so I want to bridge the gap, so unfortunately, the way to do that right now, the best thing I can do is to actually be very critical of that movement, because I came out of it, and I don't think Jesus went around attacking the other. Jesus spoke to his own movement, his own people. He called out his own people. And so that's what I'm doing. And that can get misunderstood, but I can't not do it. I just have no option of not doing it. It's just, this is in me. I have to do this. And so that's the first thing. Second thing I wanted to say, well, did you have questions about that first?
No. I was just trying to, because I have to try to force myself to memorize things too. So yeah. you told me to remind you of the echo chambers. Yeah. So that's all that's in my mind. That's the way my
brain works. Big time attention deficit, So the second thing though is my biggest advice to anyone who wants to figure out personally how to cope with this is to get out of the echo chamber. And I am a living example of that, because when I was younger, before I went into ministry, I did a couple of different jobs where I ended up listening to the radio a lot. So I was listening to Rush Limbaugh, I was listening to Sean Hannity, and then in the very early days of the internet, I was on message boards. There was one called Free Republic that's still out there that I realize now it was a right-wing echo chamber, and they were posting all of these articles, and I never was getting the other side. And I kind of got radicalized, and my whole mission with what I'm doing on culture, faith, and politics is de-radicalization of Christians. That's what I'm trying to do, is de-radicalization. But I got radicalized by, I know what it feels like I hated Bill Clinton. I hated him. I hated Hillary Clinton. I mean, I'm embarrassed to say that. It's one thing to say, oh, I think that, so I'm careful to say I don't hate Donald Trump. I don't have nearly the kind of feelings about Donald Trump that I had, all those years ago about Bill Clinton. And I believed conspiracy theories. And some of them, I still don't prefer Bill Clinton, but I was in it. The way I got out of it was when I went into ministry, I had to recognize that the people I was ministering to were very mixed. Like I said, very mixed politically. It's an inner city church, and we had, all over the board. We had Republicans, we had Democrats, and they loved each other because I was not injecting my politics in it. And I just realized the only way that I could get out of my partisan thinking was, for me personally, I had to get out of the echo chamber. So for almost 20 years, I listened to zero political news. I just cut it out of my life. And I felt so much better. And I detoxified. So like people have, conservatives have all these problems with Barack Obama. If I had paid attention, maybe I would too, but I wasn't paying attention. So it's like that's not what I was thinking about. I was thinking about the kingdom of God. I was thinking about ministering to these people. Now, I should have paid more attention. It would have made me a little wiser. Once I got detoxified, I probably should have stepped back into it. And because I think that as a pastor, I could have been more helpful about these things. But for myself personally, I had to detoxify. I had to cut it out in order to kind of save myself from just being this partisan jerk who's not really much good to anybody. That's what I was for a while. So,
wow. So when you got back into it, were you surprised at a huge transformation, or did it connect with what you had left behind in some kind of way?
So what's interesting about it is I started dipping my toes back in. I did do a sermon series in 2012 where the whole point was during that election, where my whole point was just to say, Jesus isn't a Democrat or a Republican. That sort of, Christians aren't here to pull the levers of power, that sort of stuff. So I had done a little bit of thinking about that, but I was still a Republican. I voted straight Republican. My congregation wouldn't have known, but I did. And then when I retired in 2016, in Easter of 2016, the next week. And so then I started looking at politics again, gradually. And I didn't like Trump for like what I thought were just super obvious reasons. I shouldn't say I didn't like him. Yeah, I didn't like him. I was troubled by Trump. And my naivete, though, is that I assumed everyone agreed with me. I still wasn't following it very closely. So I assumed everyone agreed with me. And then as it got closer to the election, I realized, a lot of Christians are supporting this guy. And that really bothered me. So I just couldn't. But I voted a straight Republican ticket in 2016, except for Donald Trump. I was still thinking, I was troubled by him. I was troubled by, Christians, viewing him in like overlooking things and making excuses for him and stuff. But I wasn't worried. I wasn't worried because I believed that the Republicans that I was voting for would hold him accountable, that they would keep him in check. I thought it was just like, okay, we're going to have 4 or 8 years of this guy, but he's going to do his thing. He bugs me, but adults are in the room. And so that's where my naivete over the next couple of years just kind of died a slow, painful death, where I realized, I kept waiting. I kept hoping. I kept expecting people to speak out. And that's been the hardest thing. Donald Trump himself is just, people like that are going to do what they do. The part that bothers me is Christians who, there are Christians who believe him. They don't bother me. What bothers me are the Christians who definitely know better, who came out and said things about him at one point and then changed when they realized, okay, the winds have changed and now here's the power. We're going to go for power. You mean
the VP nominee? Is that who?
Yeah. And so it just, it's that sort of thing that's the thing that's hard. That's the thing that's, it was infuriating for a few years, and now it's just like pushing on a bruise, every time it happens. It's like, yeah, this is still going on, and that's been hard.
Wow. Yeah, my political trajectory is almost identical to yours. And got out of the Republican Party in 2016. I voted for Reagan in '84. I turned 18 a couple months before that election, and I voted for the first time.
I turned 19 just before.
Yeah. And so in 2016, I was much more concerned than it seems like you were. I had lots of problems with Trump, and I saw the potential for the damage, especially in the church. And I remember having a conversation with a guy who I had been in youth group with in high school at church, and he was all in for Trump already. And I was one of the few minorities in that church. And so I just said to him, you don't realize the kind of damage he's going to create in race relations within the church. Yeah. And he thought I was overblowing it. I was exaggerating. I think I may have underplayed the extent, and that is the long-term extent of the damage.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you did see it before I did, because I wasn't paying attention. So I was slowly stepping back into it. And I just thought, well, obviously not this guy. And then he becomes the nominee, and it's like, wait, what? And I talked with somebody close to me back then who was like, because I was saying, well, there's no way he can win. And this person said, I'm not going to say what they said, but he made a comment about, we're getting this certain group of people now, and now we're going to get these people, and I thought, yeah, right. Trump is speaking to a group of people who the Democrats have been ignoring, and he could win. But I didn't. But even then, I thought, I don't like it, but I wasn't worried. It's not till a few months in, and I started to see things, and it was like, oh no, yeah.
I was terrified. I'll just leave it at that. And I still am. Yeah, I absolutely still am.
I wasn't paying attention. Yeah.
All right. So before we go, I want you to give the titles of your book that's already out and the one that's coming out, and just tell people where they can get those or where they can pre-order if that's available. Yeah.
So the one that I wrote 4 years ago, I stand by it. I think it's still, a lot of the issues I talked about in there are exactly what we're dealing with now. And then some of them are different because the pandemic was going on and stuff. It was during the middle of the George Floyd stuff, so it's like there's some things that were very much that moment, but the principle, anyway, that one is called Mega Seduction: Resisting the Debasement of the Christian Conscience, which sounds like a nerdy college title, but that's, I've never been good at marketing. So, Mega Seduction sounds like a romance novel, series, for people who like Donald Trump.
Romance in Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah, right. So, but it was based on, the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness by Satan, which was, I'll give you earthly power if you'll bow down and worship me, So that was sort of the central motif there. And then the book I'm writing right now is much more straightforward in title. It's called, as of right now, it's called A Christian Case Against Donald Trump. Like, you could not be more direct. Maybe I'll put a cute title on it. By the time this comes out, they should both be on Amazon. Mega Seduction already is, obviously. But if I get this finished up here in the next couple of weeks, it'll be on Amazon. So, A Christian Case Against Donald Trump, or some sexier title, under my name. So.
Well, I look forward to reading it.
Yeah, thank you.
So my guest this week has been podcaster and author Pat Kahnke. So, Pat, thank you for being here and sharing your stories. This has been interesting and a lot of fun.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me. This is great.
That's it for this week's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another great storytelling journey. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.
That was Stories from Real Life. Join us again next week for another great storytelling journey. See you next time.